Good morning, and I'm glad also that you are still here surviving after this 2-week intense program. I have to say I'm sorry for Chris because I wasn't here in the beginning to introduce him, but probably he did already his own introduction. And I'm very pleased, and I have to say very thankful to Chris to have accepted the invitation to come to Brazil for the first time. It's the first time that he's here. He has been traveling around for, I'd say, constantly. So he gave us a little bit of, let's say, the luxury of having him here with us. So thank you very much, Chris, for this.
Well, that's far too kind. It's my honor to be here. Thank you, Robert, for the invitation.
So we thought about doing something together, but I think because of his, I would say, contribution and to take, I would say, his presence here fully and enjoy his discussions, probably what I would suggest is to hear from you. I mean, we think when I came here last Monday, and I share with you some of my thoughts, and I have been seeing some of your drawings on the board and whiteboard there. I felt now, especially now, that we could go into, I would say, next steps and start thinking a much broader way, as Chris has said. So why don't you think in a different way and challenge him about not only his 3 points of where humanity is, and to start looking beyond the single or the interdisciplinary issues around climate change and starting coming from your own perspective to challenge his perspective. So it's up to you now, guys, to challenge him with your own perspectives of the world as you're coming from different views and visions, backgrounds. So I ask you to start challenging him, and then we'll go from there, okay? Sounds good? So the floor is yours, guys, so feel free. So we'll pass around the mic, and then you could start our conversation, okay? Anyone? I've seen a couple of hands.
If you could just say your name so that I know who.
Okay. Okay, my name is Peter de Jong. I'm from Australia, but I do study in Brazil. I have an issue with something you said, and I thought I would like to make a comment on it. And that's particularly the way you approach technology. Now, certainly technology has its drawbacks, and perhaps the problem is not technology itself, but the way it's implemented. And I'll give an example of that. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with a documentary called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, Pyramids of Rubbish. I think it's got 2 names. And it talks about how light bulbs, when they were first designed, actually they lasted much longer than the commercially produced light bulbs. And basically how it's basically about planned obsolescence, which is an example of perhaps the way technology is not implemented to benefit the environment or to benefit, these issues, but more to benefit the market and making profit. So I would have an issue putting the blame on technology, because without it, we would be far worse off. That's my general comment.
Great comment, Peter. And maybe just to violently agree with you, and maybe just to clarify, I'm not. I don't blame technology, but I think that I'm not looking for it to save us either. Right? And really, I guess the point that I'm trying to make, like some of the technology I was describing about, is not that technology is the source of all our problems, but it's just sort of an aspect of human society. Right? It is both the source and the solution. Right? And if that's the case, then when we face a challenge like climate change, right? To say, to either blame the technology or to look to the technology to save us, I think is really not the point. Right? The point is to look at the human systems that are at play. And your light bulb example is a good one, right? Look at the human systems that are operating here, whether it's economic incentives, the political incentives, what's happening in the political economy, and let's solve it there, right? I think that was the larger point that I wanted to make. What is, I think, also true about technology today, certain streams of research, is it's certainly going to generate challenges outside of the domains where it's being developed, right? So looking, for example, at the job market implications of artificial intelligence, of robotics. There's a recently formed council called the Partnership on AI, which is about how do we make AI sort of work for human society and be a positive contribution to human society. If you look, and it was just founded a couple of months ago, if you look at the founding partners, who is it? It's all the tech companies, right? And so my argument is that great idea. Let's look at that question. But if we want to look at it properly, we have to have more than the tech companies represented there, right? We also have the economists, the philosophers, the political scientists, because it's having this interdisciplinary approach that allows us to really tackle some of the challenges that are being presented by the technology. So I take your point wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Catherine from Arizona.
Catherine from?
Arizona.
Hi.
Hi. So my question is how, as scientists, we open our minds to be able to see the next map that we can't conceptualize right now. How do you think we open our minds to that?
I like that you're just throwing them underhand, right? The easy questions. How do we open our minds? Boy, that's a good question. I mean, I can give, okay, let me give an example from another domain. And what I'm really doing by giving this example is giving myself more time to think about your question, right? So that's what's going on behind the scenes here. Look at, economics, which I understand much better. It's interesting. If you look at the historical Renaissance, so this period from 1450 to 1550, if you ask a contemporary historian, they look at that period, as I mentioned, as a pretty pivotal moment in Western civilization. Medieval era to the early modern world. Somehow it happened in that century. If you ask a contemporary economist to look at that same moment in history, like a growth economist, say, they're like, nothing happened. I don't know what you're talking about, this age of discovery, this Renaissance stuff. Nothing happened. If I look at GDP per capita over that period, it didn't move at all, right? And so we have this giant disconnect. And basically what the historians say to the economists is, dude, the shifts were so fundamental that your tools for measuring their impact are obsolete, right? And so you see the same conversation happening within economics today, right? So a lot of growth economists today have a pretty glum picture at the world right now. Productivity is slowing down, innovation is slowing down, economic growth in the developed world is slowing down. So you talk about this being the best time in history to do science and discovery. We don't see it. And then you've got another camp that says, that's because you're growth economists. And you're thinking that prosperity has to be a GDP growth story. We met at a conference on the circular economy, which is basically saying we've got to challenge that whole paradigm of how we measure human prosperity. Because maybe some of the stuff that's happening now is really big, right? The shift to this new medium, for example. But our GDP statistics just don't pick it up. Because GDP is, we all know, a pretty piss-poor way to understand prosperity. So that's my example from sort of an economic lens. And I guess the question, how do we make that shift? If I think about what happens in other disciplines, it tends to be other disciplines challenge how your discipline is making sense of the world. And say, oh, it's really funny that you think this, because we think this totally other thing. So now we have to get together and talk about how to do that. So that would be, I guess, my starting point to answer a very difficult question. Because basically, I think this is your work, right? Is to somehow take a step back and ask yourself, ask your discipline, like, what is the map that we're navigating by now? I think that in itself is a hard question. And then 2, how is this map now obsolete?
Can I make comments about
please, save me, Weber. Save me.
No, just maybe give him a little bit more time to be... No, but I think the exact moment that we are here as a gathering of 30 different countries with different, I would say, people with different backgrounds and interests and needs, it is an example. The problem is, I think, is when we don't have a map. You're assuming that we have a map. So probably we have to redesign our own maps. It is very hard in the sense that, especially for young scientists like yourselves, is that there are some pathways towards success in your careers, right? So you need to publish or you perish. You need to have a deep understanding of a specific issue. And then your map is too small because the way in which science has been measured, because the tools that we're measuring the impacts of science, of course, there are indicators that we're trying to pursue, quality, I would say, a deep understanding of the problem. But I think the more we do exercise like this, I think the better off we'll be in the future to understand problems that requires a different lens. Sure.
No, I'm totally with you. And my very favorite moments in science are the moments when somebody turns the world upside down and says, we all thought it worked this way and it doesn't. And the study, because I'm a physical, biosphere climate scientist, that comes to mind for me is the Rudiman hypothesis. And so I don't know if you're familiar with his hypothesis, but he says that the Anthropocene, the era within which we as humans have changed the climate, actually began about 10,000 years ago when we invented agriculture, and that the cumulative greenhouse gas impact from a small amount of humans who used land in a different way, so there's all these anthropological, population, economics, et cetera, that go into saying, you know what, we've actually been changing the world for a really long time. And it was really controversial, and everyone was arguing with him. But those are my very favorite ways of doing science, and I think it's like exactly the example you're talking about, where someone else comes in and says, the way you've been thinking about this, the Industrial Revolution wasn't the moment. It was something else, and the way that he learned that was through anthropology, right? And I'm with you that I think that we can learn from other people, but it's just interesting to hear your perspective, because that is my challenge, is to say, what is the map? But the one thing, my one point to say about everyone has to make their own map is I think that we have to have a collective map, that our own individual maps don't do society good, that we have to together, and maybe it's through technology, maybe it's through all this information sharing and the connectedness of the world, that we have to design a new map that's more inclusive, that has more cultural perspectives, that has more continental perspectives. But I'm desperately searching for a way to have us all build that map together.
If I could briefly, just to build onto that, and then, so Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Have you read? So you have to read that, given what you've just told me. Next book on your reading list, because this is that is the book where he sort of coined the term a paradigm shift, and what that is. Brilliant book. And then two, just briefly, neuroscience tells us a little bit about what our mental maps are, and that's helpful to understand. There are basically two things, right? One is we focus on some things and we delete the rest. So to develop some self-awareness or discipline awareness around what do I focus on, like what data do I see and what data do I delete, so that I can then step back and ask, should I shift that frame, is one. And then two, because we can't process all the sensory input all the time, we develop rules of thumb, right? Heuristics. If A happens, then I'll just do B. I'm not going to go back to first principles every time A happens and consider what I should do. I just do it by rule of thumb. A then B. And maybe those rules of thumb in our discipline have gone past their best before date and need to be revisited. But often we don't even know what they are. We just use them. So becoming self-aware about what we're deleting and what our heuristics are is fundamentally, I think, what we all need to do.
Just on comment, I said our own maps.
Yeah.
And I think the first the exercise to begin this is to change our behavior. And then, which means mindset changes and things. So then we'll work much more together. So next up.
Hi, Isabel. Okay, right.
I can speak now.
Okay, right. Isabel, living the last 12 years in Mozambique.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, picking up in what you say, we tend to focus, but we delete the things around us, and then we need to step back and look to the big picture. Now I come back to Africa. I saw in your graphs, and I never saw in Africa like that, is the big uncertainty. Life expectancy of the people, population, everything. In the maps, Africa is out, completely out of the trends of the rest of the world. And we are not looking to Africa. I've never seen what is going to happen into the future to Africa, how it's going to play. And I think after your talk, I was thinking that could be playing a major player in the future because of all this uncertainty. So I want to hear your opinion about Africa in this big contest and being so different from everyone.
I mean, I think it's great that you're in Mozambique now. I mean, one of my optimistic expectations over the next 25 years is that a lot of us are going to mature our understanding of Africa. We're going to understand how crazy it is to talk about that continent with one word, Africa. I mean, there is such, well, you know this better than I do, just extraordinary diversity. Mozambique, we've got, for example, our economic situation, all this offshore oil, right? Next door landlocked neighbors who are completely different economic reality, a completely different set of development choices going forward, right? And whether it's the politics, economics, the environmental, it's all very different. And right now, we have such a crude, certainly, I won't speak for all my colleagues at Oxford, but, certainly large swaths of North America, Western Europe, we have very crude, poor understanding of Africa. And I'm hopeful that that's really going to start changing. We're going to have a lot more of a sophisticated understanding and conversation about issues in Africa. And I'm pretty confident that's going to happen because, just as sort of it seems the world's attention kind of shunted towards China around 2000, it's going to shunt towards Africa over the next 20, 30 years. I mean, it's going to be the youngest continent. It's going to be one of the most populous continents. It's going to be a lot of reasons, economic motivations for us to get much deeper into Africa. So, I mean, I guess it's a very general comment to your general comment, but I'm expecting that 25 years from now, we'll just have a completely different conversation about what's going on in Africa.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. My question is regarding...
Sorry, what's your name?
Oh, I'm Khalid from Bangladesh.
Khalid.
Yeah. My question is regarding AI, artificial intelligence. ILO says that global unemployment rate rise to 212 million right now. And this is very prominent in developing country. I can say about my country, more than 47% people are unemployed. And in this context, I'm very much worried about artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence into the job make me very worried about employment security of future for us, like for humans. So I don't support it right now. So what's your opinion? Do you think it is ethical to introduce AI into the job right now? Is it ethical?
Is it ethical?
Yeah.
Oh, what a great question. And so a couple of comments there. One, you've put your finger on a very important issue that a lot of development economists are starting to think hard about, which is, look at how sort of China developed over the last 30 years, by expanding its manufacturing. And there's a real question about whether that pathway to economic development will be available to countries 10, 20 years from now, because we just won't need labor to manufacture goods. And, as consumer preferences are moving, more and more to this, I want it right now my way expectation, instead of making everything in one country and sending it to the world, we'll make things more locally. Right? We will de-globalize manufacturing in order to serve the tyranny of the now. So that's a very serious question. And right now there's no good answer. Right? More optimistically, so still just talking about the effect of AI on jobs. So a lot of manufacturing jobs may disappear, not just in advanced economies, but in developing economies. More optimistically, that's talking about current jobs. If you look at future jobs, there's a strong case to be made to say that the future jobs aren't going to be automated away. So, for example, healthcare. You saw my picture. We're all getting older. So one of the biggest growth industries for jobs is healthcare. Nursing, caring for elderly people, caring for people who live long enough to have some mental degeneration. And that's going to require humans. Right? So the jobs of the future may not be the jobs that get automated away. Now, your real question, is it ethical? I think goes back to what, was it Peter and I? Is it Peter? And I were talking about, so there's a new research group called the Partnership for AI that is largely, entirely comprised of sort of the major tech companies. And I think the broad social concern is that it is the tech companies driving AI, right? But it's society that must cope with its implications, right? So we need to make sure that society is inserted into these conversations. So the question that you asked, I don't have the answer for, But we all need to be asking that question, right? And demanding of, also, our political system, our elected representatives, to be asking that question. Because we need to involve ourselves in this technological trend. Yeah.
Just a couple of comments also on these issues. It seems that we're passing a message that probably we are all connected through different technologies, devices, channels, or tools. A funny story. It was very funny. When we met at this conference at Oxford, they hired a facilitator to start an exercise with a group of professionals. And the first exercise, and the main exercise that the guy started doing, was to connect people. It was very funny. I thought, we are living in a different world. Because basically the meeting was very Eurocentric vision of the world. I was probably, myself and the two other guys were the only ones from outside Europe. And maybe a couple of guys from the US, from Google, that... but basically the message, they hired a very, I would say, well-known facilitator to start like a game exercise to make people connected, to interact with each other. I think probably one of the, I would say, our best asset is the capacity to make connections face-to-face, not rather through Facebook. And I think this probably will be the most powerful tool that we have, is the ability for us to make bridges, social bridges, that are strong enough to be more resilient, rather than just miles away. And to, because it was very funny, that was exercise. They hired someone to tell people how they could interact. They say, we are living in a different world. So anyway, but it's just a comment about this artificial intelligence and works and caring or labor relationships, right? We're talking about relationships in regards to climate change as well. Physical, social, economic, development pathways. Anyway, just some also additional thoughts.
And this word you use, social resilience, I think is so important. I really want to hear Holmes' question.
Let me try and connect some of the questions and answers. Number one is how do we draw the next map by having more of these kinds of meetings. I think that's absolutely vital because it builds bridges, it forms networks, and by getting away a little bit from the traditional notions of what interdisciplinarity is. Interdisciplinarity is not diluting disciplines, but being able to ask of the others the right questions. So these face-to-face networkings are absolutely vital for building those bridges, those real bridges, in order to ask our colleagues the right questions to be able to advance our own disciplines. And I disagree a little bit that it has to be a common map. There will be no common map. There will be no one map. One of the biggest advances in visualization of scientific results, of global change and so on, is geographic information systems. Geographic information systems are maps upon maps upon maps upon maps, all of them with different visions, with different content, and geo-referenced so that it still looks like a map. But the content is very, very different, so we will not have a common map. And there's another reason for the importance of the networking, and that is where you stopped your history. You stopped your history at the peak of the Renaissance. That was followed by the Counter-Reformation, by the 100-Year War, and by the peasant wars in Europe, who were being marginalized by the changing society over the following 200 years. So if we are in a very similar situation today, it's going to be extremely important that that kind of polarization does not happen. And my fear is that on the political scene, right now, I see a lot of that same polarization happening again that led us or led the world into the 100-Year War. So that there is a point where science and thinking people need to articulate, need to network, and need to try and influence political realities.
If I can just build onto that, and I think the point is so well taken. The fragility of the moment that we're in. I mean, so I'm a political scientist. Last year I stepped out on a limb and did something that political scientists are never supposed to do, especially at Oxford, which is make predictions. But I predicted that Britain would vote to Brexit from the EU and that Trump would be elected President of the United States. That was my claim to fame last year. But because I was, exactly as you said, thinking of this moment as amassing social and political stresses that were just broadly being downplayed, weren't being taken seriously enough. And it was this passive belief that the status quo would somehow sustain itself through all of the upheaval we were going through that made it even more likely that these disruptive political campaigns were going to be successful, because no one was going to take them seriously until they proved themselves serious. Much as Martin Luther did 500 years ago. I think today, again, political scientist hat. Similarly, the people today, certainly my generation, who has never really lived and seen war, we are underestimating the risk of serious state warfare breaking out. And you just, as a political scientist, you just look at the chessboard, look at where Russia is, look at what's happening within Europe and NATO. It's not hard to imagine scenarios where Russia invades the Baltics, and I won't go into it. But it in public discourse, we just don't really take these threats nearly as seriously as we should.
Yeah, my name is José. I'm from Brazil.
Sorry, José.
José. Yes.
José. Hi.
So my point is, when it comes to technology, I have the feeling that we are playing fool. We are played fool by big tech companies, oil companies. Is it just me, or technology is something that we don't control, and the consequence is, for instance, this feeling that I have, or is it the big companies that are really playing schemes on us? I don't know.
Well, I think it's a great question, Joseph, that we all kind of need to ask ourselves. So let me give two answers to that. One, maybe the simple personal answer. I'll bet that you, like me, spend a lot of I'm actively backing away from it. But it used to be the thing, like, if I have a free moment, I pull up my phone. And tap, 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 waiting for the elevator, pull up my phone. Waiting for the subway, pull up my phone. Right? It's just become the normal, how I spend time. Now, what's going on there is that there is an industry now, like a multi-billion-dollar, not maybe trillion-dollar industry that profits the more time I spend on this device. Every tap, I don't have to tap. If I spend time looking at this screen, somehow that information is being monetized and sold on. Right? I am producing behavioral data all the time that has a monetary value. And so there's a huge incentive in the industry to make me addicted to this device. And I'm becoming addicted to this device. Right? And I think that it's making my life more convenient and better and enjoyable and stuff. And maybe it is. But I'm also becoming addicted. Right? So am I in control, or is my phone in control of me? Right? This is a basic question we all need to be asking ourselves. Right? Now, about the big tech companies, and do they control? It's important to remember, especially here in democratic countries. I mean, we have so much power, actually, to set the rules of the game. Right? Why do we have these graphs of income inequality? Why are the tech companies so wealthy? Because what is valuable to them, our data, right? We give away in exchange for the leisure, the convenience, right? Now, my labor, I don't give it away unless you pay me for it, right? But my data isn't that way. I give it away for free in exchange for convenience, right? So there's a group at my research institute called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and they think about this stuff. And they're like, okay, for 100 years, we've built our economies thinking that there are three inputs: land, capital, and labor. And these things are priced and exchanged in the economy, right? Maybe it's time to make data a fourth input. Maybe time for governments to tax data. Right? So if we're here in Brazil and our population is producing and exporting all of this data to, say, Google, maybe we tax Google for that. Right? Maybe we reconstruct the whole internet so that every little unit of behavioral data that you send, you get some micropayment for. Right? There are all sorts of big picture ideas of how we could flip who is in control, right? The game. So, right now maybe the playing field is tilted to benefit the people who are getting the free data and amassing it. But there are all sorts of questions that we could ask, good research that we can do to ask about, could we change the rules of that game? And there are ideas. We'll see in 50 years' time if we still live in a world where data is free from us. Right? So, anyway, great question.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments and the presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Alex. I'm from Makerere University, Uganda.
Okay.
I have a couple of questions. One is the role of automation in the green economy, because currently everybody is trying to mitigate risks, impacts of greenhouse gases. And one of the suggestions is to build a green economy and also a bioeconomy. People are talking about a bioeconomy. So automation is occupying, actually it's a driver in technology. It's one of the things being used in innovations and invasions. So I wanted to know its role. Secondly, you talked about high technology, this massive technology, which is driving all forms of production. And also its implications in innovations and invasions, world invasions, have impacts to the environment. I don't know the inventors and the innovators. Did they think about the environment, the consequences? I don't know. And you will probably give your opinion. And lastly is about still high-tech information. There is inequitable, as far as we have gone high-tech, there is still inequitable distribution of information still, whereby access to information is power, and information is power.
Yeah.
So I don't know what is your view, because this technology must fit the situations, and this technology must fit the needs of the people. Is it for power? Is it for improving livelihood? one day will I see any app, which definitely I will not see, where I download the food, I will not see that app, maybe. So whose technology is this? And we are talking about technology to fit the bridges. Okay, they talked about the common map to be drawn, but I think technology must also somewhere fit the map. So that's my comment.
Let me. The same? Okay. Okay. Okay, you can try, and I will try to hold on to Alex's questions and also.
It's this quite the same question.
Okay.
But regarding climate change and all the projections and all the technology and renewable energy and the middle class that will consume and will produce waste, how do you see our future? Are we going to be saved by technology again, or do we have to step back in order to survive as humanity?
Okay, so these are great questions. This is a great discussion, by the way. This is a lot of fun. So I'm not going to do I'm not going to do an adequate job answering all your questions, Alex, because they're just big questions. Let me offer a first thought. So there's definitely some ways that automation is going to help to solve some environmental problems, I think. And one example is reducing waste. Right? So look, for example, at urban transport networks, cars. Right? You have all these humans driving cars, and they waste a lot of road capacity. Because I have a certain stopping distance, and so maybe I'm not so good at responding to the lights when they change. If we went from humans driving cars to all the cars driving themselves, we could probably increase, road capacity by 15, 20% without building any more road. Just that the cars are going to use the space more efficiently. At the conference where we met, actually it was a follow-on conference, another Alan MacArthur conference. I met with one of the IBM guys, and they're working on a system to reduce waste in the construction industry. And something I'd never even known about, but construction, building big buildings, there's a lot of waste. Right? We have all these materials sent to the building site to build our building, and at the end of the day, we've got a lot left over. Some of it is cement, some of it is steel, some of it is the stuff, the carpet and the chairs. And there's a secondary market for this stuff, but it's really inefficient. So IBM and a group of construction firms are looking at sort of giving every piece of stuff in the construction industry a digital identity, right? So that when we no longer need it anymore, it's very quick and easy to sell it on to someone else in the industry who does. And we're just going to make the usage of physical materials in the construction industry a lot less wasteful. Right? So these are the good stories. Right? We can see how we have environmental challenges around, say, waste, around energy consumption, and we can see how the technology, digital platforms, automation is going to help with that.
And just a comment, Chris.
Yeah.
On the issue of creating jobs, what he mentioned about IBM giving a digital information to, I would say, co-products or not residues. That what we call industrial symbiosis, where we generate several other business around, let's say, a major, let's say, core issue like building a skyscraper. It is also very intense in jobs, in creating new jobs, because the entire thing of logistics or reverse logistics, it is intense in knowledge, but also requires a lot of labor. And that is probably other ways of thinking of creating in this circular economy process, ways of making sure that the artificial intelligence will take the job of reducing even impacts, risks for labor, but we have to create other sorts of labor. And probably one example that you gave is a good one about this. And to complement, in the fashion industry, probably 78% or 75% of the entire volume of the raw material, cotton, polyester, or linen, 75% of the original stuff goes to waste. It goes to any sources of, let's say, I wouldn't go to incineration process, but I would say it goes to landfills, incineration, it goes to the water, lots of fibers goes to the water. So there's huge opportunities to rethink value chains, which consumes water, affects the climate. So there are lots of, let's say, imperfection in this linear value chains.
I just want to pick up the other really important word that Alex used was power, right? And I want to pick up on that, and it goes back to Peter's initial comment. I mean, if we really want to understand the role of technology in society, especially going forward, we have to be, thinking politically about the power here and the power that's at play. I'll give you one example. In the U.S., so to borrow the U.S. example, something like 2/3 of total R&D in the country is military, right? So, moon race, right? Military develops these technologies to send, astronauts to the moon. And 20 years later, we're commercializing a lot of these technologies for how do we communicate with something in space and all of that, right? So we have this internet now. We've commercialized these military technologies. Well, what have militaries been doing for the last 20 years with high technologies? The question is, the primary research agenda is, how can we replace human combatants? Right? That's the problem that the military would like to solve. Now, surprise, surprise, we live in a world 2017 where we have more and more powerful technologies to replace human labor. Right? This doesn't just fall from the sky and happen at us. Right? There is a kind of take a step back, look at the real politics of where is human resource and capital being invested to create technological trends, right? And so, we've, whether we're conscious of it or not, in a big picture, we've made a decision to invest in the technologies to replace human labor. Right? We could imagine, some fictional other world. We don't live in this world where, we just all believe that human labor had some deep, permanent value, and we can't replace it. We would never think of replacing it. And instead, we develop technologies to augment it, to make it more enjoyable, to make it less tedious, whatever, right? We could have gone down that pathway, right? But we didn't. We're going down a different pathway. And so we have to have, a mature appreciation of the power at play. It's developing these technologies, where the benefits are going, and let go of a more naive idea that sort of technology just happens, and the way that it's developing is the way that it has to develop, because that's just the development pathway. No, we shape that pathway, right? And the more that we understand that, then the more we'll all say, hey, well, maybe we should participate in the shaping of that pathway, which we can do.
Now, can you hear me? Jonathan from Chile nowadays.
Hi again.
I would like to ask you, I like your narrative from history. but with the connection with the current environmental problems, climate change, so-called. I read also your article that were in the list, in the reading list. So about the widespread pessimism.
Okay.
And so my point here is I'm not sure if I got it right or not, but are you saying that having this perspective should make us more optimistic about the future, or should it make us more pessimistic? And then another point is, what do you think about the views of some other current big thinkers, like James Lovelock, for instance,
Okay, yeah.
and also Mike Hume? You might have heard about him. He's sort of a British professor, and he is one of the first climate scientists that enter into the humanities and has a very, very, I would say, interesting frames to put climate change into the context of the interaction between environment and society. But so both of them are very pessimistic somehow. So James Lovelock think that, the world cannot continue like this, so it will be a crash, and then the world should continue, the revenge of Gaia, and should continue with, I don't know, 2 billion of people instead of 6, and so on. And also Mike thinks that, like, we cannot fix the climate change problem, so we have to live with it, and somehow they present sort of overly negative views towards the future. So what would be your thought about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So to sort of go back to history, there's some evidence that like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, certainly, their view, and if there's historians in the room, we can talk. I'm simplifying here, but one could argue they shared a view that was sort of, they were asking your question and sort of looking out at their society and saying, what's interesting about this moment is that there's good arguments to be pessimistic, and there's good arguments to be optimistic, right? We live in this moment where there's good arguments for both, and so we're kind of left with a choice. Right? It's totally rational, I think, to be optimistic. Look at the aggregate health, wealth, education gains. Look at we have these great challenges. We've never had more resource. We've never been so well resourced as a civilization to face these challenges. Right? That's the optimistic view. Right? And there are really good arguments to be pessimistic. Right? I mean, you just be an anthropologist and look at how historically we tend not to fix things until they really go bad. Right? So there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic too. So some of the art that we remember from sort of the European Renaissance, like Michelangelo's David, was about exactly that idea. Right? So one theory is, why did Michelangelo carve David and Goliath the way he did? So David and Goliath, 500 years ago, was already this well-known story. It's an Old Testament story about this young warrior, right, the underdog, who defeats this giant foe, Goliath, and sort of shapes the outcome of this wider war. And the classic way of showing that Bible story in European art and sculpture was always the moment of victory. Right? So you had Goliath is sort of lying on the ground, and David has his severed head, and you've seen that David has head in one hand, sword in the other, foot on the guy's chest. Right, the moment of victory. And so when Michelangelo unveiled his, a lot of people were kind of surprised by it, because the first question is, well, where's Goliath? Right? If you see the full one, it's just David standing by himself, and he's kind of, staring off into the distance. He's got a sling over one shoulder, and, his brow is kind of furrowed. because Michelangelo chose to carve into stone the moment of decision, right? Where, David he sees Goliath, he sees this threat. I don't know if this is going to work out, if I should be optimist or a pessimist, but I do know that if I step into this contest and win it, then I'm going to have a positive impact on this broader situation. And so the message, the symbolic message of Michelangelo's David is like, hey guys, and he's speaking to Florence in the 1500s, right, when they're facing invasion from the Turks to the east, and syphilis that's come over on Columbus's ships from the Americas, and we've got this new thing called print, and all this stuff going on. Guys, this is the moment that we're in, right? We've got to choose. And both choices are rational. It's really just up to us. So whether we ought to be optimistic or pessimistic, I don't know. I kind of leave that for other people. My basic belief is that if we're just optimistic, then I think we're being naive about a lot of the challenges we face, the power relationships at play, all of that. And if we're just being pessimistic, then I think pessimism very easily becomes fatalism, which is just to say, well, there's nothing I can do, so I'm not going to do anything. Right? So I think there's something in the middle there, at least in terms of attitude, which is kind of like activism, right? And so that's just my hallucination, right? I'm a political scientist, so I do a lot of reading, right? But in terms of how I personally am in this moment, my hallucination is I'm just going to be an activist about this stuff. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Back to home.
Well, you're a political scientist, I'm a soil scientist, so let me bring the argument back to Earth.
Oh, but
right. So the
nice one.
I think it's not a matter of being optimistic or being pessimistic, but you said it yourself. It's a matter of being active, not necessarily being activist, but being active. At the end of the Middle Ages, people had a very different life, a very different attitude. You were born a baker, you died a baker. You didn't question your fate. The big difference between then and now is that you can question your fate. You can make predictions or try predictions of the future because you have the tools. Specifically as a scientist linked to other scientists, you have that capacity and you can become active about the future and shape it. Not only for society, for your science, but also in your own life. I was hearing a certain technological fear of the internet and of control and who has the control and so on. Let's face it, if you walk out of this place, you don't know São Paulo, and you just keep walking, your chances of getting mugged are pretty damn good. The same thing is true for the internet. The same thing is true for dealing with your personal information and so on. If you don't look at the roadmap, if you don't bother to wipe out your cookies in a very straightforward way, you will get biased information back when you do the next search. So it's a matter of analyzing, and everybody in the room has the intellectual capacity as a scientist to analyze your personal life as well. Deal with it. You can be on top of this technology and you can shape that future whether you're a pessimist or an activist.
Well said. There was a hand at the back there. Is it still raised? Was there a question at the back there? No? Okay. No. Here? Yeah?
Hello, I'm Anthony. I'm from France and working in Argentina. So my question is I'm thinking about scientific progress. Yes. See, like in climate change thematics, we are always speaking about efficiency. Yes. So not wasting energy, for example. So I'm thinking the same about science. So on one end, we are going always very far, artificial intelligence, like looking to go to Mars, things like this. And on the other end, like you show it, there are always more like social inequalities, more like I don't know, like a problem like health problems, lot of issues in our society. So I think science is implicated in both, yes. But I think sometimes I think like maybe we are wasting energy to go too far, and we are not using this energy to consolidify our way of life and what we are living now. So my question is like, don't you think we are like building a castle on quicksand? Like we always want to construct more, go farther, like have a new more efficiency when we are working in, for example, in construction of buildings, but we are on something very fragile. And so do you think we are building like a castle on quicksand? This is my question.
I mean, it's a great question. I guess, you know, you're really asking us to reflect on the human condition. You know, it's difficult to look at humanity as a single we, right? If we were a single we with a single consciousness, you know, with a single sort of set of values, we're like, let's just take everything we've got, everything we know how to do, and let's optimize for this set of values. Then we would create a very different world than the world that we live in now. And I think the quicksand, I don't think we're going to get away from that. You know, we how can I give? I mean, so that's my general thought on that. Is that this is the human condition, and I mean, it goes back to what did Einstein say about this? I mean, like, so we had to like work to expand our circle of concern, basically, and it's the limitations of our circle of concern that make it hard to solve some questions that you step back and think it should be quite easy to solve this, actually. You know, why are we going such a roundabout way to solve, you know, remaining poverty? You know, why don't we just do big transfers and they're poverty, done. We have enough cash in the world. Cash is easy. Let's just give cash transfers to everyone who doesn't have enough. Right? Wouldn't that solve it? And then the economists and the anthropologists and the sociologists and the political scientists, you know, we all explain, oh, well, that won't work because human nature. And we tried socialism, and very short history of the 20th century was the search for a better alternative to capitalism, and that failed. So this is the best we can do because human nature, blah, blah, blah. Right? So I think that will continue to be our condition. Right? Yeah. Do you have a question? Or I haven't really paid attention who's had their hand up the longest, so I'm relying on other people to know.
Okay.
Back to Peter.
Well, going on from your point, so you mentioned 50% of the wealth is in 10% of population. In fact, I think it's more like 1%.
Of the what?
50% of the wealth in the world, goods, wealth, rich. The rich make up 1% of the world, but they have about 50% of the entire wealth.
In the OECD?
Well, I think it would be similar in other countries as well.
Maybe.
Or even worse.
Yeah, maybe.
So going on from that point, and this is a trend which is increasing. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. That's a trend which has been happening for a long time. And then looking at AI, what's the AI for? Is it for us, or is it for the big tech? I mean, okay, it's going to help them manufacture things cheaper. Is that good for me? I think we have to think about, again, going back to the technology, which I mentioned earlier. Who's it for? What's the purpose of it? Which then leads back to capitalism, which you touched on. Personally, I don't see capitalism solving these problems. unless there's some kind of paradigm shift. So tying all those pieces together, I'm interested to hear how you see things shifting so that we can have how can I put it? You mentioned we as well instead of me, and I think that's very important. So I'm interested to hear if you think that capitalism, as it stands now, with the way things are getting richer, poorer getting poorer, the policymakers don't have any power anymore. It's the big techs, the big oil who run the show. We're seeing this. So how do you see capitalism and current democracy resolving these problems? Or will we have some kind of revolution?
Right. I mean, I love the easy questions. Just keep coming. They're great. So first of all, just a slight modification. So great question. Slight modification on the data set. A lot of economists would argue that the poor are also getting richer. Right. So you look at the extremely poor. We had 2 billion. And this is the World Bank, so we can go into the methodology. But it was about 2 billion in 1990. Now it's more like 600 million. It's the relative difference that's changed. So, since 1990, least developed countries, average income per person has gone up $80, right? Whereas in the 20 most advanced economies, average income has gone up $8,000. Everybody's getting richer, but the gap is getting bigger, right? And gaps matter, right? Relative also matters. This is what the social scientists tell us, that we all don't just look at, oh, look, my pay is going up. I look at my neighbor Bob, my neighbor Mary, like, well, why is their pay going up faster than mine? I feel trapped, right? So just to clarify the condition, the poor are getting richer. And so the argument from there is, well, maybe capitalism is a model that still works. I don't know, boy. The brief answer is, before we throw capitalism out, I would like to see if we can tinker with it. So natural capitalism. What are we doing to value ecosystem inputs into the system, right? For sure, the whole regulatory regime has fallen behind the changes that we've been through the last 25 years. There's a lot of value that's just being captured by certain private interests because the regulatory regime is not saying, hey, it's great that you're making lots of money, but we've got to redistribute this, and we have a liberal democracy is our technology here for how we figure out how to redistribute that. So before I throw all of that away, I would like to see us look at, well, can we tweak the capitalist system? We met at this conference on the circular economy. Say, hey, the whole incentive environment, like it makes sense. What we're incentivized to do, we do. We just need to close that loop, and then things might work better. So I'd like to run that experiment. I think you talk about revolution. So again, political scientist hat. The big thing that has changed over the last 25 years is, what's the future of democracy? Okay. So in the late 90s, a famous political scientist, Francis Fukuyama, wrote this book called The End of History. Some people might have heard of this book. And his basic argument is that liberal democracy has won, right? We're the only viable technology of governance in civilization today. Why did he make that point? Soviet Union had collapsed. The West had won the Cold War. And if you looked at the expansion of democracy, like after World War II, 1945, there were like 9 democracies in the world. And here we were in 1997, there's 150 whatever, right? We are the only game in town now, guys. History is the story of this contest between different ideas of how to govern society. And we've won. So this is the end of history, right? Now, today, this sounds like a very naive argument, right? Because we have, for example, China, No, I actually studied the politics of China, and it's remarkable if you think, for example, that President Xi Jinping is afforded a state visit to Buckingham Palace in the UK. That last week, when there's a G20 summit in Hamburg, and there's this Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo, now he's passed away, but at that point he was incarcerated in China, critical condition with lung cancer, I think, that not a single other member of the G20 raised this issue. And so, us political scientists are saying, wow, China has done it. They've legitimized the one-party model on the global political stage, right? So now suddenly there's a China model around a far more state-driven social and economic development. We are really wrestling in liberal democratic societies with the mismatch between some of the challenges we face and their timeline and the electoral cycle. We're really struggling with mismatches between the freedom of communication and the unwillingness to manage the information space, while recognizing that there are some external actors who are quite willing to step in and try to influence the information space, right? How do we navigate that? So I think that it's not so much capitalism, but democracy that is in crisis. And we really need to take a hard look at how do we renew democracy for the challenges of the 21st century. So I'm not answering the question, I'm making it bigger.
Just a quick comment on this. I think Helm will be leading a discussion with Ines in this afternoon and tomorrow, trying to wrap up and connect all the dots and all the issues that we have been discussing. Now, going back to the issue of democracy and how the system of the UN system operates in terms of commitments. As the U.S. had decided to leave the discussions with what followed the Paris, what is your vision about the UN system and how that affects negotiations that will be more on the global common interest?
Right.
Is there a conflict between the process of making decisions to have a more like a collective global approach of a problem like climate change versus the presence of a single country or a couple of countries that decides to maybe jeopardize something that we had achieved, but it's playing by the rules, right?
Right.
They're playing by the rules.
Right.
So how do you see this as this process?
I'm sorry, these questions are so insanely big. What's my vision of the UN system? Sure, I'll give you. Yeah. So again, my half answer. I feel like somehow, and I have no idea how we get there, but I feel like we're going to evolve to a UN system around the principles of like leading countries have to lead, and so a lot of issues are going to be much less around we need global consensus on this before we can take action, and more around kind of the system theorists saying you are the systemically important actors on this problem, you have to agree. And the rest of us are going to follow one way or the other, right? So, climate change, 4 or 5 countries account for 80% of emissions, right? I would think something like that. There's an 80-20 rule there, right? The financial crisis, while the IMF is trying to regulate the entire global financial banking system, right? The systems theorists in the aftermath of the global financial crisis said, hey, did you know, by the way, that there were 20 banks that are systemically important? And if you had regulated those 20 banks, then no contagion could have happened. Like, oh, good to know, right? And so now there's a far more like a tiered approach. You're the systemically important actors on this issue. We're going to regulate you, or you guys have to agree. And I think that in the EU, for example, we're seeing the same thing. In the aftermath of Brexit, one of the ideas among EU countries is we've been operating on this philosophy that all 27, 28 of us have to agree unanimously on what is our foreign policy going to be, what is our trade policy going to be, where are we going to put the new Center for Research on X before we can get anything done. And that's just not working. So we're going to start to maybe have sort of a multi-level EU, right? Where maybe on foreign policy we all have to agree. 28 unanimous. Maybe on trade policy we need a majority, right? And create more sophisticated decision rules that allow some things to move forward and not be held back by the need for unanimity. And I think that's going to be a kind of a basic trend we're going to see in a lot of global governance forums, including the UN. But how we get there, and is that the right? These are good questions. I'm not in charge of time, so I'm just going to keep taking questions. Okay, maybe at the back, and then I'll come back to. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, please? I was passing the microphone to everybody. Here, my name is Sergio. I'm here.
Sergio. No, okay. No. I'm sorry. You're not entitled.
Quick question. Thank you. Well, socialism failed, failed badly. And that's the point. We're not, but during the next 50 years, there's still going to be voices with the melancholic remembering, socialism is so good, but failed. But it doesn't mean that capitalism won, because we are not batteries. It's not like positive and negative. We are more like I don't know the name of this in English, but it's not a circle.
Spiral?
Yes, this is a spiral, Okay. You show us that through the history, there are some main drivers which accelerated the knowledge and the improve the well condition of the human being, So just a quick comment that I believe that we're now in the revolution of information, and the new big media right now is internet. So that is, how do we build the tools to grab all this information that is everywhere and build this new map to the next 100, 200 years? Okay, so kind of, thank you.
Briefly, so I'll take a piece of that question, and actually also help respond to an earlier question. Maybe it was Peter's too, about AI, and is any of this useful, and is it going to benefit us, or is it going to benefit whom? So one of the ways that we're going to tame the information that's coming at us, and this explosion of information, is going to be algorithms. Right? So, a lot of research that I do is reading all sorts of documents and deciding, is this relevant? Is this relevant? I must ask myself that question a million times a year. Is this relevant? Is this relevant? Is this relevant? Right? So I'll have an algorithm to do that for me. Right? Is this relevant? Right? Now I'm going to have to train that algorithm. Right? And there's some risk there. Some relevant things might get through, but it's going to be a lot faster, and it's going to go through everything and say, here's all the new information I've looked at, because the technology is not limited by scale. So I can look at everything that got posted online today and tell you, here's what's relevant. Right? And so the technology is going to help us to tame the technology, or at least the information, I think. And it's also going to open up this whole question about who sets the algorithms, right? What are the values that the algorithms are embedded with, right, to make choices on my behalf. But so that's a piece of the answer to the very large question that you asked. Home?
I'm a little bit worried. I'm a little bit worried about the comment of the on the critical players.
Okay.
It's yes, Europe is saying a multi-speed Europe. Germany, France is going to call the shots.
Right.
In the world, it's going to be Germany, France, and the US, and maybe China. In Latin America, it's going to be Brazil, but not Argentina or Ecuador. I think an important thing that happened around Paris was there was a lot of work that went into the outcome of Paris since Copenhagen. There was an accord, and then the US pulled out, said, screw you, we don't want to be part of that. And with the argument that the US president was acting for Pittsburgh and not for Paris, within 24 hours, the mayor of Pittsburgh says, I am with Paris. And I think that is a very important lesson about critical players. Ecuador has a new constitution in which nature actually has something akin to human rights. Rights of nature enshrined in a constitution. So there are players at all levels from Pittsburgh to Ecuador that have to play a very important role in that transition that we're moving through. And I think we shouldn't just rely on these big shots.
Right. I completely take your point. And I mean, I guess the larger point that thank God for human diversity. Right? Because you know we need it to solve a lot of these questions. But I guess against that the challenge is, but we've got these like human decision systems, right? And how do we navigate the conflict that the human decision systems can sometimes be slow, can be captured, cannot get to the decision that all the scientists outside the room say, you effing need to make that decision, right? When there are certain sort of external things just happening that require action. And the longer that we take to act, the higher the cost this decision gets. And I think from time to time we do just struggle with that conflict.
Again, I would like to thank Chris for accepting the invitation to come to Brazil and to share with us his thoughts and views and maps and ideas about the future, about the present. And I would like to thank you guys for participating in this process. And I hope you continue to have this level of energy in the next sessions that Home and Inês will share. And we'll continue this process. And again, after I gave my contribution on Monday, a couple of you guys came and said, well, can you help us to play like a facilitator role to help us to understand some of these issues? I say, yes, of course. And probably this will be the best outcome of this first 2-week training program, international program on climate change. And you'll be part of this process that doesn't end tomorrow. We probably will need to continue this and to be engaged locally and to be active. We need to be active, so which means we need to be connected and we need to be aware that we could actually make choices, our own choices, and locally we'll make a difference. We have a lot of things. I'm not naive, but I'm very, I say, optimistic and realistic about the things that we could do. And you'll be the next breed of professionals. You're already the next breed of professionals. And we need to continue these pathways and to believe that we can make something together. Okay, guys, so thank you for Chris again, and a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Again. We will resume at 2:00 p.m. sharp here, right? So have a good lunch and see you later, guys.